The sharp scent of lavender polish clung to the air, doing little to mask the weight of history that settled over the Wakefield estate like a shroud. My hands moved rhythmically across the polished mahogany of a centuries-old cabinet, but my mind was far from the task. Tyler's face, pale, drawn, and lifeless, haunted me. His illness had come like a storm, sudden and relentless, and with it, the life we had known was slipping away. The estate felt like a world apart from my own, a place steeped in privilege, in power. But for me, it was just another house to clean, my once promising life now reduced to dusting other people's fortunes. The dreams of teaching, of living among the intellectuals like the Wakefields, were distant memories, hollowed out by betrayal and misfortune. But it was on one of those dreary afternoons, in the suffocating quiet of the estate, that everything changed. I was wiping down a high shelf in the grand hall when I noticed it, a large portrait, half concealed behind thick velvet curtains, just out of view. I paused, something tugging at the edges of my awareness. There was something familiar about it. Without thinking, I stepped toward the painting, the wooden floor creaking beneath my feet. The room felt smaller, the air heavier, as if the walls were closing in on me. My heart quickened, each step drawing me closer to something I wasn't sure I wanted to see. And then, I saw her. The girl in the painting. My breath caught in my throat. A tremor ran through me, and I dropped the rag in my hand. It was me. The girl staring back from the canvas, wide-eyed and innocent, was me, from years ago. I stood frozen, my mind racing. How could this be? My childhood face, captured in oil and canvas, hanging in a stranger's home. It was impossible. But the bright blue eyes, the long dark hair, even the ribbon tied in her hair, it was all too real, too precise. My mother had tied that ribbon on my 10th birthday. I hadn't thought about it in years, but the memory was so clear now, surfacing like a ghost from the past. I reached out, my fingers hovering just above the painting, as if touching it might unravel everything. But before I could, a sharp voice cut through the stillness. "Excuse me, miss." I flinched, spinning around to find Mrs. Wakefield standing in the doorway, her expression cool and indifferent. Her ice blue eyes swept over me, narrowing as they fell on the painting behind me. "I'm sorry," I stammered, still shaken. "But this painting." Her lips curved into a smile, but it was a cold, shallow thing. "What about it?" "It's me," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. "The girl in the painting. It's me." Mrs. Wakefield blinked slowly, her face a mask of polite indifference. "Ah, that. The previous owners left it behind. They were collectors of all sorts of oddities." Her gaze flicked to the painting and then back to me. I wouldn't give it much thought. "No," I insisted, my pulse racing. "This isn't just a random painting. I'm telling you, it's me." "Why would it be here?" Her smile faltered for the briefest moment, a shadow of annoyance crossing her face. "You must be mistaken, dear. Now, if you're quite done with your daydreaming, I'd appreciate it if you got back to work. We don't pay you to admire the artwork." I stood there, heat rising to my cheeks as the sting of her words settled in. But I couldn't shake it, the girl in the portrait was me. There was no mistake. "Please," I said, my voice quieter now, almost desperate. "Who lived here before? Who left this behind?" Mrs. Wakefield's eyes hardened, her icy demeanor sharpening. "I suggest you stop asking questions, Miss Gallagher. If you want to keep this job." I bit my lip and nodded, fighting the urge to push further. "Yes, ma'am." Without another word, she turned and left, her heels clicking sharply on the marble floor as she disappeared down the hall. I stood there for a long time after, staring at the portrait, my thoughts a tangled mess. Who had left it here? And why did they have a portrait of me from a time long before I'd ever set foot in this house? That night, as the quiet of our tiny apartment enveloped me, I sat beside Tyler's bed, watching the shallow rise and fall of his chest. His skin was pale, too pale. The doctor still hadn't found the cause, and I felt helpless, trapped in this slow-motion nightmare. Tyler stirred, his eyes fluttering open. "Priscilla?" I'm here, I whispered, smoothing his hair back from his forehead. He blinked up at me, his voice weak. You look like you've seen a ghost. I forced a laugh, though it felt hollow. Maybe I did. What happened? He asked, his brow furrowing. I hesitated, unsure if I should burden him with what I'd seen. But Tyler had always been my anchor, my confidant. I found something today, I began, my voice low. At the Wakefield Estate. A portrait. Of me. When I was a child. He stared at me, confusion flickering across his tired features. That doesn't make sense. How could? I don't know, I interrupted, shaking my head. Mrs. Wakefield said it was left behind by the previous owners, but it's me, Tyler. There's no mistake. I think it's connected to my mother. Tyler's eyes searched mine, concern cutting through his exhaustion. You think she lived there? I don't know, I said, my voice trembling. But I need to find out. Tyler squeezed my hand, his grip weak but steady. You can't ignore this, Priscilla. There's more going on here. You need to figure it out. I nodded, a chill running down my spine. He was right. Whatever this was, it wasn't a coincidence. It was a door to the past, a past I'd spent years running from. And now, it had found me. The next morning, I arrived at the Wakefield Estate with a single thought looping through my mind, the portrait. Tyler's words echoed louder than the sound of my own footsteps. You need to find out, Priscilla. His voice was an anchor, grounding me to a truth I wasn't ready to face. My hands moved absently, dusting the same mahogany cabinet I'd cleaned 100 times before, but my thoughts spiraled. Why had that portrait been there? Was my mother connected to this house? And if she was, why had she never reached out? Why had she disappeared from my life without a trace? The estate was eerily quiet. Mrs. Wakefield was away for the day, lost in her world of high society luncheons and polished facades. I had the house to myself, the silence thick as fog, weighing on me. Something was waiting here, just beyond my reach, and I had no choice but to confront it. And then I remembered the door. At the far end of the upstairs hallway, half hidden in shadow, was a door I had never been allowed to open. Mrs. Wakefield had made it clear, it's just storage, dear. No need to go poking around. Her words were casual but laced with warning. Today, that warning felt less like a barrier and more like a challenge. My heart pounded as I climbed the grand staircase, the creaking wood beneath me a reminder of the risk. Every step felt heavier than the last. At the end of the corridor, the locked door loomed. The brass lock, tarnished and old, seemed to mock me, daring me to uncover whatever it guarded. I knelt, fingers trembling as I pulled a thin metal tool from my pocket. It slid into the lock with a soft scrape, the mechanism stubborn but familiar. Time slowed. Every small click of the lock echoed louder than my heartbeat. Then, with a final twist, click. The lock gave way. The door creaked open, releasing a gust of stale air that made me recoil. I stepped inside, the darkness swallowing me as my eyes adjusted to the dim light. The room was a mess, dusty furniture, boxes stacked haphazardly, but it wasn't the clutter that held my attention. The smell. Sour and sharp, like something rotting beneath the surface. My breath caught as I moved deeper into the room, my foot striking something soft on the floor. I stumbled, catching myself on a table, but my eyes locked on the figure slumped in the corner. A woman. Frail, her wrists bound with ropes, her eyes wide with fear. Mom? The word slipped from my lips before I could stop it. My knees hit the floor as I scrambled toward her, tears blurring my vision. Oh my God. She was a ghost of the woman I remembered, her hair matted, her skin gray and gaunt, but there was no mistaking her. She lifted her head slowly, recognition flickering in her eyes. Priscilla? Her voice was cracked and raw, barely a whisper. I dropped to my knees, frantically working at the ropes that cut into her wrists. How are you here? What happened? Her breath rattled in her chest. Margaret. She locked me in here. Margaret. The half-sister I hadn't seen in years. Her name sent a shiver down my spine, memories of her icy smile flooding back. She had always been resentful, always simmering just below the surface. But this? She did this? I whispered, my voice trembling with disbelief. My mother's hands trembled as she touched my face, her fingers barely brushing my skin. She wanted it all. The inheritance. The house. She made sure no one knew I was here. Rage surged through me, hot and blinding. She kept you prisoner? All this time? My voice broke, the weight of the betrayal sinking in. Footsteps echoed down the hall, snapping me back to the present. Someone was coming. My blood ran cold. We need to go, my mother whispered, her voice urgent but weak. I looked toward the door, panic rising in my chest. The escape we'd barely begun was already at risk. But I wasn't leaving without a fight. I pulled my mother to her feet, her body frail and unsteady against me, and together we made our way to the stairs. Each step felt like a race against time. At the bottom, the front door creaked open, and there she was, Margaret. Her eyes locked on us, a twisted smile curling her lips. You really think you can take her? Her voice was venomous, her presence filling the room like a storm. After everything I've done for this family? You kept her locked away, I spat, stepping in front of my mother. You tortured her. Margaret's expression darkened, fury burning in her eyes. You were always the favorite, Priscilla. Always perfect. And me? I was left to rot. I shook my head, the weight of years pressing down on me. I don't care about your jealousy, Margaret. This ends now. The sirens cut through the tension like a blade. The police were close, closer than she expected. Margaret's face twisted in shock, then fear. You think you can walk away? She hissed. It's not over. But it was. The door burst open, and officers stormed in, guns drawn. Margaret's reign of terror had ended. For the first time in years, the weight of my past began to lift. But I knew this was only the beginning. The secrets of the Wakefield estate ran deeper than one locked door, and I wasn't finished uncovering them. Not yet. The wail of sirens grew louder, splitting the tension that hung thick in the air. Margaret's wild eyes darted between me and the front door, her chest heaving. Her control was slipping, and she knew it. Priscilla, my mother's voice rasped from behind me, her grip weak but urgent on my arm. We have to go, now. I glanced at her, my heart aching. Her gaunt face, the hollow eyes, she had suffered so much in this place. And Margaret had taken too much already. We couldn't wait any longer. Margaret's voice cut through the moment, venomous. You really think you're going to just walk out of here? She stepped closer, her smirk cold. You always were naive. Do you even know what you've gotten into? Stay back, I warned, the shake in my voice betraying the fear coursing through me. The police are coming. This is over. Over. She laughed, a hollow, bitter sound. You have no idea what's at stake. If you think I'm letting you ruin everything I've worked for, you're a fool. Her hand shot out, grabbing a heavy brass candlestick from a nearby table. My breath caught as she swung it, the candlestick whistling past my head, crashing into the wall with a sickening thud. Stop, Margaret. I backed away, heart pounding. It doesn't have to end like this. But her eyes blazed with fury, and she lunged again. Margaret, please. My mother stepped between us, her voice raw with desperation. It's over. Let it go. You don't have to do this. Margaret's face twisted in rage. Shut up. You never understood. I deserved everything, and you, both of you, took it from me. She swung the candlestick again, narrowly missing my mother. I'm entitled to this. I pulled my mother back, my arm screaming in pain as the candlestick grazed it. Blood welled, but I didn't stop. There was no time. The back door, if we could just get to it. Mom, come on, I whispered, urgency sharpening my voice. We can get out through the garden. She nodded, breathless, and I half-dragged her toward the back. Margaret's furious footsteps pounded behind us, But I could hear the police shouting now, the front door crashing open. So close. Just as my hand brushed the doorknob, Margaret yanked me back, her fingers digging into my wrist. "You're not leaving," she shrieked, her grip iron tight. I spun, meeting her crazed gaze. "I'm not letting you hurt her anymore." Her eyes flared. "She never loved me," she spat. "It was always you. Always the perfect daughter." Her voice cracked, turning ragged with years of resentment. "But I've been in control. And I'm not giving it up now." Her grip was fierce, her desperation giving her unnatural strength. I twisted, struggling to break free when the door burst open. "Police." "Drop the weapon." Margaret froze, her eyes darting between me, my mother, and the officer with his gun trained on her. For a moment, everything hung suspended in time. Then she let out a guttural scream, raising the candlestick high above her head. But before she could swing, another officer barreled into her from behind, sending her sprawling. The candlestick clattered to the floor, and Margaret's anguished cries filled the room as she fought against the cuffs locking around her wrists. "It's over," she screamed, her voice breaking as they dragged her toward the front. "You don't understand." I stood frozen, barely able to process what had just happened. My mother's hand on my arm finally broke the trance. I turned to her, seeing the fear and relief mingling in her eyes. "It's over," I whispered, more to myself than to her. She nodded, tears spilling down her hollow cheeks. "We're free." Hours later, after the statements and the blur of flashing lights, I sat beside my mother in the quiet of the guest house. She had fallen asleep almost immediately, her body too weak to fight anymore. I watched her, the weight of everything pressing down on me. The years we lost. The lies, the betrayal. And yet, we were here, alive, together. Margaret was gone. But the scars she left behind felt as deep as the night sky above. A soft creak broke the silence, and I looked up. Detective Harris stepped into the room, his expression a mixture of stern sympathy. "How's your mother?" he asked quietly. "She's resting," I replied, my voice raw. "We'll be okay. Eventually." He nodded, his face softening. "Margaret's going away for a long time. Kidnapping, assault. She won't hurt anyone again." I managed a weak smile. "Thank you." Harris hesitated, then added, "You saved her life today, Ms. Roberts." "I did what I had to," I whispered, more to myself than to him. As he left, the door clicked shut, and I leaned back in my chair, staring out at the stars. The night didn't feel as heavy, but something lingered, an unfinished puzzle. Margaret wasn't the only secret this house had hidden. There were still answers waiting in the shadows. And I knew, this wasn't over yet. If you liked this story, please subscribe, like, click the bell, and leave a comment. Thank you in advance.